Welcome to Worthy of Love, the podcast for ambitious, self-aware women who desire to deeply connect to healthy love. Whether you're single or in a relationship already, this show is here to help you slow down, reconnect with your body, and to help you realize that you are capable and worthy of cultivating and maintaining healthy love, even if you have a history of toxic relationships. I am your host, Celia Antonio. I'm a certified relationship coach and a certified female sexuality coach, and I am so grateful that you are here. Now let's get into the show. Hello, welcome back to the show. Since we are a few episodes in to Worthy of Love, I thought that it was time for me to do a little episode where I'm kind of introducing myself and getting a little bit more personal so that you can understand and get to know the girl behind the microphone. And also because you might relate to my stories. And I think it's very helpful to hear someone else share something that you resonate with because you know that you're not alone and because you can maybe get some inspiration of some solutions of like things to do moving forward. And you can also receive a lot of hope when you hear someone's story if you resonated with where that person used to be versus where they're at now, if the like destination they're at now is somewhere that you want to be in. So yeah, we're going to get a little bit more personal here. And this was kind of inspired by a question I was recently asked at a women's circle where someone was asking me about my work and they were asking me like a specifying question about what it is I meant about helping ambitious women with toxic relationships. She was asking about what does toxic relationships mean? Does it mean just romance? Does it mean like being raised in a religious environment? What does that mean? And I basically told her that everything is relationships and in okay. And I basically told her that it could be any of those things because everything is about relationships and how we do one thing is how we do another thing. And I realized after that, like as I was reflecting on that conversation, that I have had toxic relationships in my past, not just in romance, but also toxic relationship with my body, with food, in friendship. Like there's been many different areas because again, how you do one thing is how you do something else. So let's dive into my story. And I am sharing my story genuinely with so much gratitude because I think the beauty of healing is that you can get to a place eventually where you feel genuinely grateful for your past and you really wouldn't change anything because it made you who you were today. And that's exactly how I feel. I feel like my past made me who I am today. I like who I am today. And I feel like my past has also given me some unique opportunities to relate to humans on specific areas, like if we have similar threads within our stories. And yeah, so where should I begin? Let's start with childhood because everything comes from childhood. Everything kind of stems there. That's kind of like the little seed. So for me, the first toxic relationship that I have ever had has unfortunately been with my mom. And the reason why is because when I was 3 years old, my mom and I moved to a new country. I was born in Germany, and my mom and I moved to the US when I was 3. And within that move, she wasn't open with me about my dad. And I always knew, like she got remarried pretty quickly after we moved to the US. she, or maybe it was right before I moved to the US. Now that I'm thinking of the year. No, it was right after because my sister, thinking of like the year my sister was born. So she got married pretty quickly after we moved to the US, and she basically pawned off my stepdad as my biological dad. But I knew the whole time that he wasn't my dad, and I never really understood why. But now, as an adult and having had in my professional experience some experience working with kids, I know now that, a 3-year-old is smart enough to know who their parents are. And just because they aren't having full-fledged conversations doesn't mean that they are dumb, and doesn't mean that they won't notice if dad is suddenly a different man. And so for me, the reason why my first toxic relationship was with my mom is because at a very young age, the trust between us was broken. And for as long as I can remember, that trust between us was broken. And the whole idea and concept of like, where is my dad, was something that loomed over me for my entire childhood, like in private, because I unfortunately was raised in a household where I didn't feel safe to ask those questions. And I'm not entirely sure why. I have some theories, but I won't, this episode could easily be like 8 hours long. So, yeah, I didn't feel safe enough to ask. And so something that I didn't know stemmed from my relationship with my mom. I didn't know this until I was older, is that I had body issues and I had a very toxic relationship with food. And when you look into the literature about mother wounds, usually when a woman doesn't have a harmonious relationship with their mom, they tend to not have a healthy relationship with their body. Um, Part of it is because we see mom as like a role model of how we should, of how worthy we are. And when we don't feel worthy, we don't treat ourselves as if we are worthy of love. And that can manifest as having unhealthy relationships with your body. So I remember being like around 11 years old and making myself like, I was noticing that I was breathing. As I was breathing, my belly was expanding. And I vividly remember forcing myself to breathe in through my chest so that my stomach could be flat. And part of this toxic relationship with my body also came from the environment that I grew up in. I grew up in Los Angeles, California, and the whole Hollywood body image and beauty standards definitely looms over girls that live in that area. I have talked to a lot of women about this who grew up in that area and like no longer live there, and see the contrast between their kids growing up outside of LA and the differences between that. So a lot of the behaviors that we have that lead to toxic relationships, they come from more than one place. So yeah, I grew up in a dysfunctional family. My parents did the best that they could, but they were very, very young, so they didn't really know exactly what they were doing. And between my age, when I think about myself when I was 3, coming to the US and like being a person that needed to be openly spoken to about who my dad was and who my stepdad was, and that my stepdad was now taking over this role, there was only a teenager's worth of time between me and my mom and also my stepdad. And of course, they wouldn't know what they're doing. I would say that for most people, that's not enough time to be a parent that could be like fully there for your children unless you come from a very specific family where you were seen, you were heard, you grew up with like freedom of expressing yourself, because then you really get to know who you are and you're going to be more equipped to be a guide for someone who's new to this earth, um, if you have that foundation. But my parents did not have their foundation. I won't talk to like their own traumas and stuff just to protect their privacy, and also because I don't really know the full story. They're very mysterious. Um, okay, so dysfunctional family. I moved a lot when I was a child. From the time like I was 3 and I moved to the US all the way until age 11. I can't even tell you how many times we moved and changed schools. That there are some friends to this day that I wonder about, and I don't even remember their name, or I might know their first name, but not their last name. Because again, I came from a dysfunctional family, so my parents didn't see the value in me keeping in touch with my friends. They just saw, like, I remember bringing it up to them that I was going to miss my friends. They just saw it as, oh, well, you'll make new friends in your new neighborhood. And one person that I did get to keep in touch with from age 10 on, we would write, she moved right after 5th grade, and we would write letters to each other. And then eventually that communication spanned to probably MySpace. I'm not sure if we did MySpace. We definitely did Facebook. And now that I've moved to the East Coast, I live 2 hours away from her, and we saw each other in person recently for the first time in like 25 years, I think. And I saw her parents for the first time in 25 years, and it was amazing. And yeah, I don't know why I shared that, but I felt very grateful driving away from hanging out with her. I felt very grateful to my younger self for, when I was younger, my friends were my everything. I think it was because I didn't feel emotionally supported at home. I was always very lucky that I had food, I had clothes, I always had a place to live, but emotional um, presence wasn't something my parents were able to give me, partially because of probably their own stuff, and also because they had to work. They were very young, they were under a lot of stress. And this is one of the reasons why I wish our society was more supportive towards children and towards families, because not everyone comes from a family where the parents have that capacity to really be there with you emotionally. And I think that emotional abandonment really affects you as you grow up. I definitely feel a bit behind compared to like my peers, and have been doing a lot of work on this, and still do feel very grateful for my past. But yeah, it's definitely a thing. And I feel like if our society was more supportive towards mothers and families and children, that families who don't have the means to not be stressed out about money, those families would have more of a chance to raise confident kids. And I think the more confident children we raise, the better our society will be. But again, disclaimer here, I am not a mom. And yeah, I guess that's another thing to talk about. So, because I had a toxic relationship with my mom, I always dreamt of one day being a mom. And there were times, probably as young as 7 or 8, where I would be just like crying and so frustrated about like my relationship with my mom, and saying to myself, like, one day I'm going to have a baby and I'm going to be a much better mom than her. And that thought would like give me hope. Like that, in hindsight, I realized I was very depressed as a child, but also I had this very strong inner dialogue that kept me going. And I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if that's like something that every child has. I don't know if that's something that like certain people are born with. I don't have any idea. But when I think back on it, I think it's pretty cool that I was able to self-soothe because I really I was pretty depressed as a kid. I just didn't recognize it as depression. So, let's talk about a little bit about toxic relationships with religion and like purity culture and how that affected my relationship with my body and with myself. So, I wasn't really raised in a religious environment. However, my grandparents on both my biological dad's side, which we'll get into the story of my biological dad soon, and my mom's side, both of those grandparents came from religious families. I recently learned that my biological dad's parents moved to a new city to kind of get away from the super religious influence of their families of origin. And then my grandmother on my mom's side, I recently visited her and I saw all of her like photo albums growing up and with like First Communion and all these like super religious kind of like ceremonies, or I'm not sure what they're called, like the First Communion and all the other ones. I honestly don't know what they're called. And it's interesting because my grandmother is not, she's very open-minded. She's not religious. And my mom is not very religious. She's very open-minded and very like a liberal type of person. Um, but then my stepdad, who raised me since childhood, he came from a super religious family. And not only that, he came from a super religious country. And he told me that he moved to the US to get away from that because where he's from, the religion was basically the law. And from a time when I was very young, he would always tell me that he would always say religion is bullshit. And all you have to do is be a good person. And I remember one day coming home with a necklace with a cross on it. It was a gift from one of my friends in elementary school. And he told me, like, we don't wear that in this house. Like, he was very anti that because his religion, where he came from, suffered a lot of violence from Christianity. And because of the religion that he had, like I said, he wasn't very religious, but there were certain points in my childhood where his sister lived with us and also his mother lived with us. They were both at separate times, but I think they were right after each other. And they are both very religious to this day. And for context, their religion, they are Muslim. And in the Muslim religion, women are very much taught to serve men. Women are taught to serve men. And I remember when my grandmother and aunt lived with us, there was very much like, oh, when your dad comes home, make sure to have a glass of water ready for him. And like, we were very much like, me and my sister were very much trained to like clean and like take care of the house and all that stuff. I'm not saying that's necessarily bad. However, having a brother and seeing how he was treated differently and being taught about this religion and like what it meant for me as a girl, like I remember learning that like once I was, I think around 12, that I would have to wear like long sleeves and long pants all the time and like never show my arms or like basically cover up my whole body. I remember like just thinking in my head, like, I really hope I don't have to do that. I lived in LA still at the time in Glendale before it was gentrified. And it would get really, really hot over there. And I just remember like feeling bad that like just because of their religion, they had to wear these long sleeves even though it was a hot day. I also like just want to say I don't mean to disrespect any religion. I just think that every human should have the freedom to choose what religion they resonate with rather than a religion being pushed on them. And I also don't agree with how some religions oppress women. And this is what I really felt like that happened to me. And it made me feel ashamed of my body. It made me feel like there was something wrong with like touching my body. It made me feel like I was bad, even though I really was a good kid. I honestly was a very good kid. And yeah, that's what I'll share about religion. Also, just like collectively growing up in the US, I think purity culture sinks in whether or not you were in a religious home or not. At least, at that time in the 90s, I remember as a kid, like seeing a lot of conversation around like purity rings and like saving yourself until marriage, like on Disney Channel and like from Disney stars, which again, I don't like want to disrespect. Like if that's what you believe you should do, if that's what you did, great. I just remember it making me feel like, I've very much always been a person who just wants to be free, and this felt like the opposite of freedom. And I didn't really fully understand what saving yourself till marriage meant or what sex meant at that age. What I just understood was that there are these very authoritarian feeling strict rules, and that just didn't feel good in my body. Um, Another thing I will say is I went a couple times to church with friends, like once I was a little bit older, maybe like 12, 13. Um, and I remember even younger than that as well. I think I've been to a church once, but I remember my very first time learning about like God and that, seeing people address God as like a father and like he and him with a capital H. And I just remember being like, huh, that's weird because I have a little brother and a little sister and they came out of my mom. And so it didn't make sense to me that God would be a man. Like from a young age, the very first time I was exposed to that idea. So I always like, I didn't think that made sense at all. And then in the Muslim religion, they don't depict God as a person. It's like a light and an energy. That to me made more sense and like still makes more sense, even though I'm not a religious person. Okay, where do we go from here? I apologize for not having this. I don't have this scripted, so I hope that this doesn't sound all over the place. But so now we are, let's say the last age I mentioned was like 12. So around age 12, maybe a bit younger, is when I remember in school having to bring home a permission slip for my mom to sign in order to allow me to watch a video about puberty and growing up. And I felt, and still to this day, felt like I was completely unsupported in puberty. And I felt like my mom did a much better job with, and still to this day, because she works with kids, I feel like she does a really good job with younger kids. And then once puberty comes, I feel like she didn't really know what to do. And I remember asking her when I brought the permission slip for her to sign, I'm like, what is this about? And she was like, oh, when you bleed in between your legs. And I was just like mortified. I was like, what? And again, we had the type of relationship where like I didn't feel safe to ask questions, so I didn't ask her anything. And I was just terrified. And then when I watched that video in school, um, I remember like in the video, I think they said your first period can start as late as 16. And I remember just like crossing out my fingers and being like, please don't let that happen to me until I'm 16. And then when it did happen, I had so much anxiety and so much of like an inner battle to climb over in order to be able to even communicate to my mom that I had gotten my period. And it was just so mortifying. And I actually kept it a secret for an entire day because I just didn't want to tell my mom about it. I just wanted to avoid it because we never had any difficult conversations. Things were always just avoided. And I brought it up to her because we were at a Costco and I'm like, okay, I need to say something now because here's where that she could buy something for me. And we were there, my whole family, my stepdad, my brother, my sister, and they bought me an enormous box of pads. And I remember when we got home, my stepdad was like holding the big box as we were in the elevator to get up to our apartment. And he was like, congratulations. And I just like wanted to crawl into a hole and die. Like it was so embarrassing. Reflecting back on like how insecure we feel when we're young is kind of cute. Um, Gives me a lot of compassion for children. And I feel like if you're going to have a child, it's very important that you remember what that felt like and like what it is that you needed at that time to feel a little bit more safe in your body and to feel safe to ask questions. Because that time is such a time of like, it's like dysregulating and unstable and everything's changing and you don't know what's going on. And yeah. Okay, so moving on from then. So then we enter like, it's like middle school and your peers are starting to like date and have their first boyfriends. And for me, every time someone would ask me out, I would just say no because I didn't want to. First of all, I didn't want to deal with talking to my parents about having a boyfriend because that's mortifying. Second of all, my stepdad was so strict that I just knew boyfriends were not allowed. And so I would just say no, even if I liked the person, I would just be like, no, I'm not going out with you. And that really sucked. But I thought at the time that it was much better to just not get into that and not have to deal. Like it felt a lot safer to just not do that thing that will get me in trouble, that will, like, I won't even know how to communicate to my parents about it. So I'm just not gonna go down that path. And then from there, like we'll get back to dating later because I didn't really start serious dating until later on. So from there we're in like high school times now. And in high school, I didn't really fully realize it at the time. I didn't actually really realize this until maybe 5-ish years ago. I had disordered eating in high school. And the way disordered eating showed up for me was I was very obsessively tracking my calories. Um, I would restrict. If I was ever angry at my parents, I would not eat. It was like my form of protest to just not eat in front of them. And if they would leave the house and I'd be home without them, then I would go eat if I was hungry. And that's not a healthy relationship with food. That's a toxic relationship with food, and probably toxic relationship with your emotions as well, because you're using anger to like not eat. And there would also be times where I would eat a lot of food, not like an insane amount that I know other people who have like binge eating experiences have. Like, it was never to the point of like extreme stomach ache, but I would eat a lot of food at one time. And then because I would do that, I would obsessively exercise. I would like go for jogs. I would like walk all the way to the gym, work out, and then like walk or jog all the way back. And the walk to the gym from where I lived to the gym was probably like 30 minutes. This was when we lived in the South Bay in California, and the gym was on PCH in Hermosa Beach, like right after Pier Avenue. It was 24-hour fitness. And then I lived in Redondo Beach on Carnegie Lane. So if you're familiar with that area, you would know like that's how much I was walking. It was a lot. And that area has a lot of like hills up and down. So it's a lot of calories that you're burning. And my relationship with food was toxic from high school all the way until my mid 20s. My relationship with food didn't change until I started practicing yoga, because my unhealthy relationship with food stemmed from my unhealthy relationship with my body. And when I started practicing yoga, I started, my perception of my body changed. It changed from being this part of me that determines my worth into this part of me that is a temporary vessel that I am borrowing to have all of my lived experiences. And I started having way more gratitude and respect for my body, and realizing like I am my body's keeper. And so it is up to me to take care of my body. And something I've talked about in a workshop before is the experience of realizing that your body is like this infant that you get to take care of. And that really solidified for me when I was around 26 and I was doing a lot of babysitting at the time. And I remember there's this 4-month-old little girl named Hannah that I was babysitting, and noticing that all of her needs that she had are needs that I also had. And they are needs that every human being will have for their entire life. They're, these very primal needs of like needing to go to the bathroom, needing to eat, needing to drink, needing to sleep, like those basic primal needs. And that was when it really clicked for me, like, oh my goodness, my body is this infant and this baby, and it's up to me to mother it. And no one else is going to do it besides me. So it was the combination of my yoga practice and having that spiritual awakening of seeing my body in a new light, and the experience of being exposed to newborns and noticing those similarities between a newborn's body's needs and an adult body's needs. And so I invite you to try that on if that resonates with you. If you have a toxic relationship or a difficult relationship with your body, what would shift if you tried on the perspective that your body is a baby, that you're the only one that will take care of it? And if you're someone that has kids, maybe try on that perspective. If your body was your child, like what would change about your self-care and your self-love and your self-talk? Okay, so let's get into, I'll share 2 more pieces. So I'll share my toxic relationship with work. So I shared already that I came from dysfunction, and like my friends were my everything. And just kind of this I very much wanted to escape my home from a time that I was very young. I remember like counting down until the day I turned 18 because I'm like, that's when I'm legally allowed to like leave and I don't have to live here anymore. And so because of that, I very much took to heart what teachers in school would tell me about like getting good grades and like staying in school because then it would lead to, getting a good job. So I was very much like my ambition started in childhood and I like wanted to make my own money since I was young. And I remember actually getting in trouble in elementary school because I was selling bracelets that I made. I was selling bracelets at school for $1, and that's apparently not allowed. It's against school rules, and you're also not paying taxes on it. So, yeah, so I threw myself into school. When I got to college, I threw myself into, like, I remember after my first, I went to college part time. And after my first two classes, my parents sat me down and told me that they couldn't afford my school. And I immediately was like, no, 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 I'm going to school. I will figure this out. And in college, I basically was either always at school, always at work, or I was at home doing homework. Like there was no social life aside from the boyfriend I had at the time. That was a toxic relationship. We can get into that. Um, but that was all. I threw my all into it. And the problem with coming from a dysfunctional family where I always had this looming thought over me of like, where's my dad? And I didn't feel safe to express myself was that I didn't actually know who I was at the age when you decide, what is it that you're going to go study to do for the rest of your life. So for a while there, I really did, I had to work on a lot of anger with my past on how it affected what I ended up studying. I went to art school. I have a bachelor in fine arts degree. But like I said in the beginning of this episode, I have total and complete gratitude. And I recognize now that the reason why I studied art, and not only the reason, but I realized that like art is the only thing I could have studied at that time because from a young age, I was always getting lost in drawing. I was always getting lost in art. And I didn't know it at the time. I recognized it once I was older, but that was my form of self-therapy. Art was my form of self-therapy, and it came in many forms. It even came in the form of like really getting lost in music once I was a teenager. And it came in the form of like painting, pastels, doodling, drawing. And then eventually in high school, I learned how to make clothes. And then I decided to study fashion design because out of all of the art forms I'd been exposed to, I thought fashion was very cool because you end up with a physical thing that you can actually use. Like, you wear this coat that's going to keep you warm in the winter versus like a painting or a drawing would just like hang on a wall. So I thought it was very fascinating for me to get to make art that someone could use. What I didn't know at the time was that the fashion industry itself is a very toxic place. And as I was really in the thick of that world while I was in school and for the few years that I worked in the industry, I very much had a toxic relationship to fashion. I was like constantly shopping, constantly like looking for that next outfit and just constantly obsessing over my looks. especially once I graduated and I was working at a evening gown like atelier. And however, okay, wait, what else? The environment in the fashion industry as well, at least in my limited experience from where I worked, was very much full of gossip. And I had already been, by the time I graduated, I had already been at a point in my self-development journey where I was like, gossip is a no. Like, I am not going to put my energy into gossiping because that is not something that's going to bring any good to anyone's life. And so I remember having a lot of difficulty really fitting in with the culture of the jobs that I had. And that gave me a lot of stress. And what else gave me a lot of stress was that there was this constant in the fashion industry, there's this constant looking forward many years ahead. Like right now it's 2025. If I was still working at my old job, we would be working on the like 2027 fall collection right now. Like we'd be like coming up with the ideas for that. And then after that, like it just keeps going. You're like working 2 years ahead. I feel like that also was very anxiety inducing for me. And because of all the stress I had, I decided to start going to yoga classes. And I'd always heard that yoga was good for relieving stress. And going to that first yoga class is like that one decision that changed the rest of my future because like I mentioned before, it changed my relationship with my body. I also eventually became a yoga teacher. And that decision very much led to me being here on this podcast today because it led to me becoming a certified female sexuality coach. In case you don't know this, yoga comes from Tantra, and yoga, my sex, love, and relationship coaching certification is Tantra based. So it comes from the same place. And doing that personal work of your feelings, thoughts, beliefs, and emotions about sexuality was really is really just a deepening of mindfulness work. Like if you are someone who has practiced yoga for a while and you want something deeper, going into sacred sexuality work is that next level to really ground in and deepen more. So if that resonates with you and you'd like to work with me, I do have one-on-one coaching spots open. I also am about to reopen up my breast massage course. It's called Heart Magic. It really is a self-love and self-sensuality course, but it's done through the art and practice of breast massage. Okay, so to get back to our story, first I'm just going to turn on the light because it just started storming and it's dark. That helped a little bit. Hopefully it doesn't storm too much because sometimes the power does go out here. Okay, I'm going to go into my story about my dad and how that affected dating. Um, I also didn't mention, let me actually mention first female friendships and the mother wound, because those two things kind of happened at the same time. But okay, so a really common thing when women have toxic relationships or unharmonious relationships with their moms is that female friendship becomes difficult because our mom is our first opportunity to relate to another woman. And so when that experience, when we're babies and young kids, when that experience made us feel unsafe or unseen, we create a belief or a story about women unknowingly. This happens unconsciously. And then we take that belief with us into, the world when we're, going to school for the first time and starting to make friends and when we become adults. We take those beliefs with us and it affects our relationship with other women. And so I remember in 2015, I was out of college for a couple of years, and I just left the fashion industry to teach yoga. And I finally had, because I wasn't working a ton and I wasn't, like I said, in high school, I mean, in college, I was always working or at school or doing homework. I didn't have capacity for friendships at that time. But now, flash forward to 2015, I was like, okay, I need friends. Why don't I have any friends? And I started exploring the literature of the mother wound because I knew that I had a mother wound. And I was going to like self-development seminars and doing all this work on myself. And I realized that I had learned that women were unsafe from, my relationship with my mom. And so once I noticed that, I could recognize that that's actually not true. And that gave me more confidence to put myself out there and make other female friends. And it's also not as simple as just changing a belief. I also did a ton of therapy, did a lot of embodiment work, did a lot of somatic work. And I finally feel like now in 2025, like 10 years later, I feel like for the last 2 years, I have been having experiences with women and with groups of women that I never even dreamed were possible or didn't even know was possible. Like this past weekend, I went to a women's circle at someone's house and I was just like, wow, this is like the girl hangout of my dreams. And it made me think of an experience I had earlier this year at someone else's house as well, before I moved to the Cincinnati area, where it was also like, wow, I can't believe this is what we get to do. Where, we're together, we're having deep conversations. It's safe to cry. It's safe to like feel your emotions and be your wild, primal, authentic self. And I wouldn't be having those experiences if I wasn't brave enough to look into the mother wound. I feel like the mother wound is a very tender thing to look at because mothers put in so much labor to create the next generation, and it's labor that is definitely not valued by our society. And, she is the reason why we are here, why we are alive. And so it feels very unsettling to admit that there are some wounds that we might have received from our relationship with her. But I hope that hearing me say that I feel gratitude for my past, that I love my mom, that I have a lot of compassion for her, and that I realize that she really was doing the best that she could at the time. I hope that if you are someone who hasn't dove into the mother wound, I hope that gives you some hope and inspiration to dive into it, because it is something that will make you feel more whole, because it will change your relationship with yourself and it will change the type of female friendships you have the capacity to have. Um, okay, so let's go into romance. So then on the other side of the coin, our relationship with our fathers affect our relationship with men. And so if you are a woman who dates men and you don't have a good relationship with your dad, or there's some thing with your dad that caused some wounding, you're subconsciously going to look for that same characteristic in the men that you decide to date. So if your dad was emotionally unavailable, you most likely are someone that will go after emotionally unavailable men until you recognize that pattern. And once you recognize that pattern, do the work for your own inner child to be seen and do your own personal work. Then you will feel the confidence and the desire to date men who are emotionally available. And then the thing that is difficult about that is then when you do date your first emotionally available man, the work isn't done there because that relationship is going to trigger you and a lot more stuff is going to come up, which is why don't um I don't think that full healing can come from never going into a relationship again. I don't think you can be at a place where you're like fully healed and fully perfect in order to be in a relationship because our most intimate relationships push our buttons in a way that those buttons won't get pushed if we are single. And those are invitations to then deepen into whatever triggers are coming up. A trigger is always an invitation to notice, like, why do I feel uncomfortable with that? There's some sort of hurt under here. So, my relationship with my stepdad was the one that first affected the type of people that I wanted to date. So, my stepdad, again, he did the best that he could. I really love and appreciate that he raised me as his own without, he like respected my mom's wishes and never told me that, like, I'm not your biological dad. We have now, as an adult, we have had a conversation about it. And my stepdad, I can actually talk to him more than I can my mom. Like he's more available for conversations in a way where my mom hasn't been able to be. And so my stepdad growing up, he was very authoritative, very much like the man is the person who makes up the rules and you have to obey. And that very much comes from his culture, coming from an Islamic culture. That's very much how it is over there. And that's probably how it was in his family. I am not sure. His father passed away when I was very young. And that's probably also something that added to the way my stepdad parented, is that there was definitely grief and pain from losing his father when he was pretty young. I think he was probably like 21, and that's a pretty young age to lose a parent. And so when I first had my like first serious boyfriend, he reminded me a lot of my stepdad. I remember like noticing like, oh, like my stepdad does that too. Where he was very controlling. He didn't like me having any friends. He was definitely a narcissist. But it was so comfortable for me because this was such a normalized experience for me that I stayed for 6 years. I stayed for 6 years. And it took me that amount of time to be able to speak up for myself and stand up for myself and finally leave without being like, there were plenty of times in that relationship where I would say I was going to leave, but then, as narcissists like to do, I was manipulated emotionally because he would start crying and take advantage of my empathy. This is something that narcissists do. We can maybe talk about like narcissistic tendencies in a future episode. So that happened, and then I finally broke up with that person, and then unknowingly, I ended up in that same relationship again, only this time I only stayed for 3 months. 3 months in, I was like, nope, I deserve better. But what also happened? So, one thing that happened was, again, my yoga practice very much helped me be able to speak up for myself. My yoga practice is actually what helped me break off that 6-year-long relationship because with my yoga practice, I started hearing my intuition more. I started being able to hear my inner voice more. And it got to a point where I couldn't not listen to my inner voice's desire to not be in that relationship anymore. I couldn't stay any longer. I couldn't try to contort myself to make it work anymore. I had to go. Even though I didn't know what was going to happen, where I was going to live, what the future would look like, I had to leave. And yeah, then the same thing happened again pretty quickly after, because another thing that can happen when you come from a dysfunctional family, usually, and this was the case for me, usually you'll have a fear of abandonment. And so when you have this fear of abandonment, it's very hard to be single. And so if you break off a relationship, you are very susceptible to jump into another relationship immediately after. Or you could have had the pattern where before you even break off the first relationship, you have the next person already lined up. That's something that's also very common. And this comes from the fear of abandonment. You don't want to be alone. And so being single is something you'll avoid at all costs. So another thing that happened was that towards the tail end of that second relationship that lasted for 3 months, I finally met my biological father. And he basically treated me like a princess. I was working 9 to 5 at the time, and I remember he was staying with me, and he would ask in the evening, like, what time do you have to get up for work tomorrow? And I'd tell him the time. And then when I would wake up, he was already up and he already had breakfast ready for me at the table because that's the time I'm going to wake up. And that was so sweet. I had never had that kind of treatment from a man before. And he listened to me. It was just such a different experience to get this like princess treatment from my dad and for him to be this like genuinely kind guy that really gave me that boost of being like, no, I won't be treated in a way that's disrespectful by a partner ever again. And that gave me that boost and that confidence to break off that second relationship after 3 months. And so then I was single for a while. And after, I think I was only single for 6 months or maybe like around a year or so. And then I finally was in my first relationship that was healthy. And like I said before, when we are in a pattern where we date a certain type of person and we change that pattern, like how I mentioned with emotionally unavailable versus emotionally available people, once we get into that first healthy relationship, it's going to bring up a lot. And for me, what I didn't notice at the time, but for me at first, the relationship was very nourishing because I was like, wow, I did not know that men like this exist. I did not know that a boyfriend could be this like respectful and fun and like want me to socialize. And that relationship was really the push for me to work on my sisterhood wound, which stems from the mother wound, so that I can be able to have a separate social life from my partner. And I remember he would reflect things to me like how I would say sorry all the time. And so with him, I got out of that habit of saying sorry all the time. But then as the relationship went on, my old trauma came up in the way where I started becoming like terrified of losing this person. Again, that fear of abandonment came up, that I stopped being myself and was a little bit more like aware of like, what is it that he wants me to be and playing into that. And when I look at that relationship in hindsight, and see my part of it, even though he was the one that ended things, when I see my part that I played, I can definitely see that because I had that fear of abandonment and decided to like codependently cling onto him, that was at least my side of the street of what started to kill that relationship. And after that relationship ended, it was such a huge heartbreak. Like, I remember feeling like physical pain in the center of my chest because I was so heartbroken. And I was very lucky that I had support. I had only moved to New York maybe 6 months before. We'd moved to New York City together. And luckily, I had already made some friends in New York City. And luckily, I had a couple of those friends who have had been dumped before and know what it's like to be there. And even though they'd only known me for a couple of months, they really showed up for me. And they let me vent and they took me out. And I started seeing a therapist again in New York City. I started doing somatic work for the first time and embodiment work. And I'll add in here why I think embodiment work really works and why I think that um, we can't just heal from talking about our problems. Like a lot of the typical ideas of therapy is that you are sitting on a couch and just like talking about your problems. And a lot of the typical ideas of self-development work is that you're again on this language level where you are looking at your limiting beliefs and like changing those beliefs. That work is great, but I think going deeper into your body is really what brings the change. And I'm going to tell you a story about why I believe this. So, right before this ex-boyfriend broke up with me, um, I was invited to do a dynamic meditation workshop. A friend invited me. And then when my ex broke up with me, I didn't want to cancel on my friend. So I showed up anyways. And when I walked in, it was 3 days post breakup. When I walked in, my internal dialogue, I remember saying to myself, I will never be happy again. Like, I didn't see the possibility of ever being happy again because that's just how sad I was at the time. But going into that dynamic meditation, and in that meditation, like we did breath, we did sounding, we moved with our bodies, we journeyed through our emotions basically. At the end, I was genuinely smiling from ear to ear. And one of the experiences that really stood out to me that I feel like was the shift was that towards the end of this meditation, we had to dance around the room, but we were blindfolded. And the teacher was there to make sure we weren't going to run into each other or into a wall. And it was in a big room, and there were only maybe like 6 participants in the workshop, so it was safe to dance around blindfolded. But I remember as the music started and I'm blindfolded, I remember doing like very small movements, like kind of like keeping my limbs tucked in because I was afraid of hitting a wall or hitting something. And I was afraid of what was in front of me. And as soon as I had that thought that I'm afraid of what's in front of me, I realized what a metaphor that was for my current point in my life, that I was afraid of what's ahead without my ex-boyfriend. I was afraid of what's to come. And when I noticed that like distinction, I started moving a bit more freely. And then I was eventually, like leaping and twirling around the room, realizing that I am safe. I'm safe to move forward no matter what. Like, I'm here, I'm alive, I'm breathing, and that means I'm safe. And that was really like that turning point for me. And so if you are someone who is going through some sort of heartbreak, maybe it's a breakup, maybe it's some sort of grief, I invite you to not just talk about your grief, not just think about it, but actually take the time to feel it in your body. And another thing that helped me at the time was I was taking the time to cry, but I was also taking the time to hang out with friends and quote unquote pretend like I was okay. And why I say quote unquote pretend is because at the time I was trying on the idea of I can be heartbroken but also make space for fun. And so when I'm with my friends, let's fully be present in this moment and what's there. And knowing that I was going to make space later on when I was home to cry and to feel my emotions really helped me be able to be present when I was with my friends instead of having like obsessive thoughts about my ex. I did have, some friend hangouts where it was a friend checking in on me and asking me, and that was different. But like things like dinner parties and other social gatherings, like I really did the work before and after going to these events to be able to be fully present there because that also gave me a lot of nourishment. And I think that that's a good reminder that our emotional spectrum is a spectrum. And when we are going through a breakup or when we're going through grief, it doesn't mean that we can't still access joy or love. We can still access it. And you can access it. Like if you've probably had an experience at some point where you're like crying over something and then someone says something that makes you laugh. You're always able to have that capacity to laugh. Of course, genuinely. And yeah, just wanted to share that. So today I am married to my absolute best friend, absolute soulmate. And I think my entire journey of what I learned with changing my relationship with my body, changing my relationship with female friendships, healing my mother wound, healing my father wound, meeting my father, and um, getting that princess treatment. And also to this day, like I talk to my dad all the time. We FaceTime pretty regularly. I talk to him a lot more actually than I talk to my mom. And also changing the relationship with work. I don't think I talked about that, but my relationship with work definitely changed a lot when I started practicing yoga, and then even when I started my own business and started really leaning more into embodiment work and exploring what is divine feminine. And doing practices like breast massage really helped me be able to slow down, which is why I have that as a course. It's called Heart Magic. I invite you to sign up for that waitlist. Currently, as of now, so I'm recording this on Monday, September 22nd, 2025. Happy equinox, by the way. I am at the tail end of finishing up the updates for Heart Magic, and I will be finalizing the days of the live calls soon. And if you happen to be watching this in the future, you can probably sign up right away. Like all the live calls were probably recorded and you can sign up and get instant access to that course below. So I'll include Heart Magic linked below. But yeah, to go back to what I was saying, my relationship right now with my husband, we talk about constantly how our past learnings are the reason why we are able to have such a healthy relationship. And we actually have known each other since we were 13 and we were just friends. And we talk about how if we would have dated when we were in high school, we would not be together today. because we both had to go through toxic relationships and learning how to A, not be toxic ourselves, and B, not to go after people that are toxic. So there's both sides of that coin. Um, that was what let, like, those learnings from having those experiences gave us the skills in order to relate to each other in a healthy way. And everything is relationships. So one relation, like your relationship with your body is going to affect your romantic relationships. Your relationship with religion is going to affect romantic relationships. Even your relationship with romantic relationships is going to affect your relationship with religion, with your body, with food. Like, it's all intertwined and it's all connected. And that's why I think this kind of work of really healing the relationship with yourself, because all of these external relationships get internalized into how you talk to yourself. Healing that is the place where you will change your life. It is the place where you'll receive more grounded confidence. And yeah, I could keep going, but I think this episode is long enough. I would love to know if you relate to any of my story. I would love to read your comments. If you happen to be listening to this, I will include a link to this episode on YouTube so that you could leave a comment on the video, because I genuinely want to know what it is that you relate to from my story. And thank you so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye.